Lawrence Zelenak is now joining us on BookTV from Duke University. Professor Zelenak, what do you teach here?
I teach tax-related courses, federal income tax, corporate tax, a tax policy seminar.
At the Duke Law School?
Yes.
Okay. You have written a recent book, and the title is Learning to Love Form 1040. Two cheers for the return-based income tax. A lot of people are going to look at the cover of this book and go, huh?
I'm sure they will. Well, if it was easy to love Form 1040, you wouldn't need a book about learning how to love it. The basic argument of the book is that although there's a lot of reasons to be frustrated with the 1040 and the fact that the vast majority of the population of the United States has to file income tax returns every year, there's also some underappreciated virtues of it.
First of all, where did the 1040 come from? Why do we call it the 1040?
That's a great question. I don't actually know the answer. I mean, the IRS has always had an elaborate numbering system for all of its forms, but how this happened to be 1040, there's another book there. Sorry.
When did it come into creation?
It sort of depends on how you count. The federal income tax was instituted in 1913. The 16th Amendment made it possible, and then just a few months after the 16th Amendment was ratified, Congress promptly enacted the first income tax. But the first income tax applied only to the top 1% of the population. It expanded significantly in terms of how high its rates were during World War I, which kind of coincidentally came right on the heels of the first income tax, and the tax, which initially had been kind of symbolic, became an important revenue raiser. But all the way through the 20s and through the Great Depression, the income tax remained a class tax rather than a mass tax. And in 1939, on the eve of World War II, only 5% of Americans lived in households that were subject to the income tax. By the end of the war, in 1975, it was about 75%.
1975,
I'm sorry, 1945, it was 75%.
75% of Americans were subject to income tax.
And what happened, of course, was that the government needed a tremendous amount of money to finance the war. There was no way that that could all be gotten just from the top 5% of the population. Everybody agreed that the tax was going to have to, that some federal tax was going to have to be imposed on the substantial majority of the population. It wasn't inevitable by any means, though, that it would be an income tax. In fact, most of the nation's opinion leaders in newspaper editorials and, more importantly, in Congress thought that the way to go was with a federal retail sales tax. And it was only because the Roosevelt administration, for reasons which actually I think don't make an awful lot of sense, was implacably opposed to a federal retail sales tax that we ended up with the mass income tax instead.
And we don't know why?
Oh, I know why. I just think it doesn't make much sense.
What is the reason why?
Because the president and his Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, were firmly convinced that sales taxes are regressive, and by contrast they thought of the income tax as progressive, and they wanted a progressive mass tax. The reason that didn't make much sense is, while it's true that a sales tax in isolation is regressive, if you consider the combined distribution of the tax burden under an income tax that applies only to the top 5 or 10% of the population, and a sales tax that applies to everyone else, versus a mass income tax, there's no reason why those distributions had to be any different. So he was basically thinking of the sales tax in isolation rather than as part of a system with the income tax. But anyway, he won the day. Congress wasn't interested in trying to force through a sales tax over his opposition. And we've had an income tax to which the vast majority of the population is subject ever since.
By 1945, what system of deductions and credits were in place as opposed to today?
Most of the things that we think of as the really classic deductions that individuals take on their 1040 were in place by then. The charitable contribution to deduction had been around almost since the beginning of the income tax. The medical expense deduction had been around for a while. We didn't think of it as the home mortgage interest deduction because there was just a general interest deduction, but there was a home mortgage interest deduction, and the deduction for state and local taxes. They were all there already. And they were there even before it became a mass tax. It was just that only 5% of the population cared about it. More recently, the explosion in tax breaks since the end of World War II has been more by way of credits than deductions. So there's the $1,000 per child tax credit, which came in the last couple decades. There's the earned income tax credit, which is tremendously important and was introduced in 1975. So to oversimplify, most of the things that you think of as the deductions that you might take on your return have been around pretty much forever. The credits, for the most part, are newer.
When you talk about two cheers for the return-based income tax, what does return-based mean?
Well, there's a lot of countries that have income tax systems but don't require people, or at least don't require a lot of people, to file a return. They work on the basis of what's called exact withholding. If you think about it, the payroll tax works that way. You pay a payroll tax, but you never file a return because the employer takes out the exact amount you owe, and you simply never see that money. But the income tax is too complicated to be administered in that way, precisely because of the deductions and exclusions and credits you were just asking about. And in order to make the income tax work, to reconcile the withholding with the amount of tax that you actually owe, you have to file a tax return. And I think what makes the income tax unique in American popular culture among taxes is the fact that it's the only tax that calls attention to itself through requiring almost everybody to file a return. One way of thinking about this is if you look at all of the taxes that are raised in the United States at the federal, state, and local level, the federal income tax is only about 25% of that. In fact, even at the federal level alone, most people pay more payroll tax than they do federal income tax. Yet whenever anybody thinks about taxes, what they think about is the income tax. You can see that in all sorts of ways. When Mitt Romney talked about the 47% of the population that don't pay tax, he was talking about the income tax. By the way, a lot higher percentage of the population than 53% files tax returns, but some of them don't pay income tax, and I want to come back to that. I've also done a study, and this was a lot of fun, of how the income tax has been reflected in popular culture since the end of World War II, looking at primarily two things: situation comedy episodes based on the income tax, of which it turns out there's about 100 altogether, and New Yorker cartoons, of which there's more than 200. And I was looking not just for income tax related sitcom episodes and New Yorker cartoons, but for tax related episodes and cartoons generally. But it turns out they're virtually all income tax. So if sitcom episodes were distributed across tax topics according to the amount of revenue that the different taxes actually raised, there would be almost as many payroll tax episodes as there are income tax episodes. But of course there aren't any payroll tax episodes, and there's 100 income tax episodes, and the reason is the return-based nature of the income tax forces you to pay attention to it. And the reason I say two cheers is because I think in one way that's a good thing, and in another way it's a bad thing. Why it's a bad thing is the more obvious, right? That it's been estimated, I quote an estimate in the book, that people spend someplace in the neighborhood of 3.5 billion hours a year preparing their tax returns, pulling together the records, preparing the returns themselves or consulting with their tax return preparers. And if you value their time fairly conservatively,